All right, so we are going to pick up with Argument at a Glance. That is going to be for Tuesday, March 12th. And when that file gets opened up, we're looking at PAPA, P-A-P-A. All right, so this is very, very straightforward. And again, when you're writing, whenever it's for the sake of an argument, remember PAPA. All right, so the first, ask yourself, PAPA, why? Purpose. So what is the point? Not necessarily the point of why you're working on it, because the quick answer is, I have assigned it. The second is, what are you hoping to do? Why are you writing? What are you writing? All right. And then that will tie into the last A, of course. So purpose, why, what is the point? What are you trying to prove? For second point, first A, audience. Who? Who are you writing for? All right. This goes beyond parents or students, but age, what do they know? How much life have they lived? Second, ethnicity, where are they coming from? What baggage might they carry into this conversation? What is their gender? What is their sexual orientation? These are all things to consider when you argue a certain point, because your whole thing, you have to think like you're a politician. You're trying to win votes. You're trying to win an audience over, not prove someone wrong. That you're proving someone wrong, that's not your audience. Your audience is here to listen, and we want to learn. And so therefore we stop and we listen to you. We give you the floor to talk. And so you need to make sure that you know who you are writing for exactly. Second P, persona. How do you structure your words? How do you structure your thoughts? What words are you using? Which comes down to diction and tone. So when we think about persona, we're going to open up this file. And there's two things we're going to look at. And that is, when we get to it, spoken voice versus the written voice. So when you think of the spoken voice, yeah, sure, teachers harp all the time on, it sounds informal, you can't use slang. And that is true. But one thing you really need to consider when we talk about spoken voice is that you tend to be really worked up when you're passionate about something. Therefore, that's one thing that we want to eliminate. We don't want it to be so emotion driven, which is perfectly fine when you use pathos, but I don't want you worked up in your paper, because that's going to turn people away. So the written voice, what do we focus on? What do we focus on when we talk about something like the written voice? The written voice allows students to incorporate their own personality and creativity into their piece, but it helps pull you away from common language. So, making sure that you're not using slang, that's part of the revision process. What you should be focusing on is a professional language that's somewhat detached, meaning if you were emotional, you've kind of taken a step back, because we don't want to come across biased, and we don't want to come across as like too worked up, because that will turn someone away. That will turn an audience away. So we need to be a little detached. We need to be a little unemotional, or most importantly, we need to be neutral. Because if we have an audience that's willing to listen to both sides of an argument, we need to let them know that we are just as calm and collected as they are. And we're just here to share information, thoughts, and you can buy into our opinion or not. That's up to you. Take it or leave it. That's the best kind of approach to have when it comes to this. So again, spoken voice, sure, informal slang, we don't want it, revision process if needed, but it's mostly about emotion. So when it comes to the written voice, we make sure that we've cleaned that up and that we are neutral, we're calm, we're collected. That's going to bring us back to tone and diction and connotation. The words that you choose, their meaning, making sure they're not overly charged words, or when we want to use an overly charged word, that it actually fits the bill. Okay? Which means for those of you that love the thesaurus, you need to make sure that you're using the correct word. All right, tone, remember, that's what you put down and the audience picks up. So you don't want to come across like a jerk because you phrase something a certain way. Last A, argument, tying back all the way to purpose. What are you trying to prove or disprove, and how or with what? So this is all about your approach. How manipulative, how sneaky are you trying to be? Are you trying to be transparent? Well, that's claim, what you have to prove. And second, how are you using evidence, meaning your approach? First would be ethos, all right? But with ethos, we have ethical appeals, sure. Trustworthiness and credibility. How do you build that up? Well, you build that up with pathos and logos, believe it or not. So the first, you get someone to listen to you. Well, you're going to use a passion or emotional appeal, which means you're going to use base emotions. These are things that we all have that we immediately connect with. the need for sleep, the need for food, the desire to be loved, all very simple things that we want. Higher emotions tend to be a little bit more nuanced. These are emotions that we can say that we desire, that we want, but we don't necessarily need right off the bat. That brings us to logos. Logos is logical reasoning, where we use anecdotes, stories to help sell certain ideas, facts or statistics, and that's going to help build up your ethos, believe it or not, because the more you present, the more credible you would appear. But you need to make sure that you're not just putting numbers in front of an audience without really breaking down what they mean and why you're utilizing them. So I could come up to a whole group of people and say, hey guys, here's X, Y, and Z about this topic I'm very passionate about, but I'm not really going to explain it. So you're going to question my trustworthiness, or in most cases, my credibility, because it seems like maybe I'm ill prepared. But if I came in and I'm very eloquent, I have a concise thesis, and I then jump into facts, statistics, and I even throw in a couple side stories, a couple anecdotes, then you're like, oh, who's this guy? He really knows his stuff. That's someone that I would trust to, for the sake of maybe voting. Okay, that's when ethos and logos get connected together. Pathos is something that we layer on in case we are struggling to get an audience to understand why we're so passionate about something, or in some cases, if our approach is a little weak, pathos comes in and it works like the glue to hold something together. It's our adhesive for the sake of an argument. So with that, that is PAPA, purpose, audience, persona, and arguments. Awesome. So that is going to bring us to our second document for the day, which is argument claims. And it's very straightforward, this one. So we have 4 claims for the sake of building on a thesis. And the first is a claim of fact or definition. And I'm going to come up with a couple examples because the name defines itself, which is a little punny considering this is a claim of fact or definition. So I could say that, and this is one that I encounter in the classroom all the time, is whether or not a student's grade actually measures achievement. So right there, I'm making a claim about tests and quiz scores, and if it's actually truly reflective of one's work, their knowledge, and how much they've achieved over a period of time. Okay, if it's definition, we can argue over the definition of something, but it needs to be something, as far as like terminology goes, that's a little murky. There's a lot of gray area to argue something. So some people might say, well, either you know the material or you don't. You didn't study hard enough. Some people could argue things like test anxiety and other clear examples as to why someone may not perform well on tests. So that brings us to number 2, claims about cause and effect. So we talked about this earlier in regards to smoking versus secondhand smoke. But let's talk about something a little different for this activity. So bullet trains from point A to point B, traveling well over 250 miles per hour. I think some ballpark at over 300 miles per hour, but that's neither here nor there. We're talking about the idea of a track that may go through some areas that culturally it would be an insensitive thing to do. So for this example, we're talking about a bullet train that would be traveling from Beijing to Tibet. Now, without getting into a lot of the cultural issues here, just know that Tibet and Beijing don't necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of things because one's a little new school, one's a little old school, and in some cases there have been territory disputes over the years, but that's a discussion for another time. But what people are talking about is the Tibetan culture could be at stake with this bullet train being built from point A to point B because it's going to, one, get in the way, and it's going to disturb the monks that live there, and so on and so forth. And so as far as cause and effect, we'd be talking about building this bullet train and the negative causes that they would have, and case by case, how that's going to affect the Tibetans. All right. Now, on the opposite side of that, you could say that the cause and effect from Beijing to Tibet could be very beneficial, and you would talk about all the positive effects that would come with this. And that is claims about cause and effect. That brings us to number 3, claims about solutions or policies. What you need to know about this is going to be where we start to layer on our claims, which means more work for you if you choose to do that. I need some coffee for a second because my throat is dry. All right. This claim is a perfect example of how two different claims can overlap over each other. Claims about solutions or policies usually work hand in hand with claims about fact or definition. Now we see correlation. For example, because the healthcare system does not adequately assist Americans, you could argue that fact. So let's say that one more time. For example, because the healthcare system does not adequately assist Americans, they should be reformed. So you're starting with making a fact, an arguable fact, and then you are going to argue a policy. Do we need reform, or do we need to just throw the whole thing out the door? All right. So again, you're choosing a position that is arguable, not something that's like, okay, now we can all agree on that and move on, and then, la-di-da, go skip off into the sunset. That's not what we want. So any policy relating to underage minors is always controversial because it's difficult to define when an adolescent is capable of making a deliberate decision just as an adult would. All right. At this point, this is something that's probably really important to you. So just like we talked about with the past document, you need to kind of take a step back from the situation and reassess who you are and where you are. You're a teenager, you're upset, rightfully so. Everyone tells you how terrible you are at things or why you can't have certain responsibilities or rights. It sucks, I get it. But if you're choosing to argue that, you need to take a step back and making sure that you are removing your speaking voice and we're focusing on a written voice, which means less passion, at least emotional outbursts, and it needs to be more focused, make sure that it's a little bit more deliberate. So those were claims about solutions or policies. Again, you start with a fact and then you argue for a solution or policy. Number 4, claims about value. All right, you cannot spell evaluate without value. And that's the easiest way to remember that, because anytime someone talks about the value of something, how great it is or how terrible it is, you are immediately evaluating everything they have to say about that item, that concept, that product, you name it. So if someone says, oh, this item is the best or the most superior, you then have to listen to that laundry list of items. You do not cut them off at just something so-and-so is the best, but you listen, because each piece that they mention, it's going to be your job to pick apart because you're evaluating. Okay. So while other writers should anticipate how to respond to the opposing viewpoint, it's particularly crucial that we do this when we're dealing with a claim about value. So either someone has told us everything about it, or we have to anticipate it, which makes our jobs even harder because now we're like mind readers. So if someone's saying that out of all the amusement parks, Disneyland is the best, we have to figure out why. Cost of ticket? Yeah, right. They could be talking about the ambiance of the place, the number of shops that they have, the quality of the bathrooms, the rides that they offer. All right. We need to think, what is going to be this laundry list of perhaps positive things about Disneyland that makes it the best amusement park? Well, who knows? Because we have to be mind readers unless we've read a detailed argument that we're now picking apart. So it's one or the other. All right. For the sake of a separate argument, example is UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championships. One could argue that UFC is a dehumanizing sport, that seeing two men fight and just clobber each other is a dehumanizing thing to watch. Others might say that UFC fighters undergo this extensive training and skill-based martial arts training. They have to learn so much in order just to beat the competition, thus making it this viable athletic competition. Now, if that's the opposing viewpoint, you would need to have this laundry list of examples that point out how it's dehumanizing. What about it? Because someone else is going to argue that, no, this is a martial art. This is very difficult to pull off. Therefore, as a result, you need to, basically plan, prep, and make sure that you've done your research. All right. So with that, those are our 4 claims: claims about fact or definition, cause and effect, solutions or policies, and claims about value. Thanks, guys.